You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast where we're getting into a little bit of opinion scholarship again after some time off, so apologies. I haven't been able to do a solo episode in a little while. I've been quite busy. But I have been reading some stuff. I wanted to speak with you guys about two books. So mostly we're going to focus on Irreducible by Federico Faggin, but also a little ditty called The God Theory by Bernard Haisch. The reason I wanted to talk about these particular books is because in both cases they're legitimate scientists that are writing about spirituality in a scientific way, which is something I think is sort of missing from the modern dialogue. It's something I think has been missing and desperately needed for a long time. And I always speak to these particular figures in history that weren't afraid to continue to talk about religion and physics, religion, and science, and speaking about them together, trying to reconcile them, or being a scientist but also very mystical, like Arthur Eddington and Isaac Newton and Alfred Wallace and just a bunch of people we've talked about before. I just feel like there's this huge, rich opportunity for really interesting conversation about how modern theories of science might help to or how ancient theories of science that always border on the religious or are explicitly religious, how they may come into maybe adding some perspective or ways of understanding some of our modern scientific theories that are weird. Quantum physics is key among them. So I don't really know where to begin, but I guess the reason I wanted to speak about both books, The God Theory and Irreducible, is because in both cases you have characters like a Nikola Tesla, like an Alfred Wallace, like a Swedenborg or Eddington or Humphrey Davy. Like you have these significant scientific minds that are speaking about spirituality and science together. Bernard Haisch does it a little bit more explicitly in The God Theory maybe than Federico Faggin does. But both are credentialed, important scientists in their own fields. With Bernard Haisch, it's, I think, mostly astrophysics. With Federico Faggin, he's actually one of the OG computer scientists, but he speaks from the perspective of quantum physics. He does a lot more than that, by the way. In this book, if you're interested, the book is really not about what I'm going to focus on. It's almost peripheral to the book that he wrote here. But the primary topic is it's artificial intelligence and whether consciousness is something that can be programmed, whether it's something that we have to worry about computers becoming conscious. That's kind of in the zeitgeist today, and so he really tackles that question. Spoiler alert, he doesn't believe that it's possible to compute consciousness, and he makes a lot of really good arguments, and they're worth reading, but that's not really what I'm going to focus on today. What does he also do? He also, in this book, develops a very interesting, detailed, kind of speculative model. It's a scientific model, but it's borders on the philosophical or maybe even the metaphysical, but a model of how consciousness might be a fundamental property of nature, maybe the fundamental property of nature. So there's all sorts of philosophers who've spoken about it. Idealism and panpsychism are these really common philosophical schools that talk in this way, that consciousness is fundamental, the way that science believes quantum fields are fundamental, okay? So he does a bunch of that, and really it reminded me a lot of Alfred North Whitehead. And if you have been listening to the show since the early years, you remember we did a bunch of episodes on Alfred North Whitehead and his process, metaphysics. And this is kind of what Federico Faggin does. I mean, when Whitehead is talking about these basic units of experience that make up the world, he calls them actual entities, if I remember correctly. Federico Faggin calls them seities or consciousness units, and he tries to make it, as scientific as possible. But he goes on to basically describe how mind and matter are not different things. They're one thing. They're irreducible. And how they sort of evolve together along the same trajectory. So we imagine from a scientific for the accepted scientific paradigm that we have a Big Bang, and then the forces of nature and physics, they evolve over time to change the state of energy, let's say, that was there at the Big Bang, to become the created universe, to become the material universe, I should say. And along that same trajectory, like you may have energy that spontaneously becomes atoms, and then atoms start bonding together to create new atoms, and whatever it might be. Then they become, elements, and those elements come together to become, larger matter, and then gravity takes hold and starts pulling planets together. We know the story that science tells, but Federico Faggin says that whilst this is happening, you have to imagine that, again, consciousness is fundamental. So as this is happening, consciousness is also along for the ride. You might say along for this evolutionary journey. So consciousness begins to interact with other consciousness. They form, together to form, larger units of consciousness. Just like the atoms become, elements, and elements become larger matter. So just imagine that there's this material evolution along with a psychic evolution, or an evolution of mind, because they are together. They are inseparable and have always been that way. Matter and mind are one thing. So this is kind of how he tells the tale. But while he's telling the tale, he speaks about quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and the whole weird quantum world that we've talked about before many times. He talks about them in a spiritual way, in a way that I remember hearing a little like echoes of this from the Amit Goswami episode that we did, because he's a similar thinking philosopher. But Federico does a really good job, I think, of showing you a very interesting parallel between the way that science and modern physics talks about the quantum realm and the way that human beings for thousands and thousands of years have talked about the spiritual realm. And so is it possible that what science has discovered, in the the turn of the century, with all these interesting figures of the quantum revolution, Max Planck and Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and all these, and Einstein and all these people, is what they discovered some sort of validation of our religious intuitions, that there really is a spiritual component to reality, something like that. So that's what we're going to get into today. That's what I'm going to focus on. So without further ado, let me jump in. I'm going to call this episode A Vaster Reality, because that phrase comes up a bunch in the book, but I also think it's interesting because I've talked about having a mystical experience of my own and how it changed my outlook about reality and God and religion and all that stuff entirely, as it does when you have that sort of experience. But what the mystical experience showed me is that there is a reality that I can no longer deny because I had this weird experience. There is a reality to a supranormal or extra-normal realm of experience. There's a part of reality that is not the normal waking reality that we experience every day. There's something else. There's something weird. That what is possible, what is real, is a vaster reality than just our daily physical reality. I didn't know that until I had a mystical experience. Turns out Federico had something of his own mystical experience, so it will make sense. But as we open this up, I want to do what Federico did in the book. I want to open this book, or this conversation, by criticizing this sort of modern scientific philosophical paradigm. I know it's a mouthful, but really what I mean is some of these ideas that modern science is rooted in or based upon. These are kind of assumptions, and many of you are going to hear it and you're going to think these are reasonable assumptions, but they are unproven. They are assumptions. And once you start rocking the boat on that, once you start realizing that there may in fact be a less solid foundation underneath them than you think, then it starts to allow you to be more open-minded about the possibilities, about what all of this quantum weirdness means. So before I do that, and by the way, we saw a bunch of people in the past that make this argument. Philip Goff did a good job of making this argument. Rene Descartes does a good job of making this argument. But I'll just slow down for a second, and I want to tell you a little bit about Federico Faggin in case you don't know who he is. I didn't know who he was, but in the book he gives us a little bit of a biography, and so the highlights are this guy is one of the, as I said, OG computer scientists. So he invented silicon gate technology while he was working at a place called Fairchild Semiconductor back in 1968. Right? OG computer scientist. This guy's working on silicon gate technology in the 60s. Okay. He also designed the first microprocessor in the world back in 1970. Okay, so this is the caliber of person that we're talking about. All right, so that brings me to this idea of this scientific philosophical paradigm that I mentioned a little bit earlier. What kind of all of modern science is based on in terms of these logical or philosophical assumptions. This is the bedrock. These are the things that they don't question, but they assume is true. And let me just read to you. There's 4 sort of ideas. The first one is called realism. Realism means that reality exists independently of us, independently of our minds, that there is an objective world out there, whether we're here or not. That's realism. Okay? Again, I told you many of these are going to seem like reasonable assumptions, but I want to point out that these are things you haven't questioned before. If you think that way, if you're convinced of it, you probably haven't thought about it deeply enough, because we're going to start to bend these, and Federico is going to do this. He's going to start to bend the logic here until you're questioning things like this. Does reality exist independently of our minds? Science says yes, that there is an objective reality. This is called realism. The next one's called materialism, and it means exactly what you think it means. Everything that exists is made of matter and physical processes. This is materialism. All that's real is matter and physics, okay? What that means is it potentially excludes things that aren't physical or material. What might those things be? Religious people will point to things like the spirit or the soul, or philosophers of mind will point to things like consciousness and say these things aren't material and they're not physical. However, the scientific paradigm doesn't go there. It writes all of that off. Why? Because it assumes that everything that exists is made of matter and physical processes. All right, the next one is called reductionism. Reductionism means that everything, every system, every whole can be explained so long as you understand its parts. If you know what makes up the larger thing and how it works, you know everything there is to know about the thing. Okay, so if you know about atoms and energy and physics, you can explain the entire cosmos, right? These are reasonable assumptions, you would think. Now, this excludes something. It excludes the idea that the whole might be greater than its parts. There might be something that exists that isn't explained by what makes it up. But science doesn't go there. Why? Because science agrees with this idea of reductionism. Everything can be explained if we just understand what makes it up. And the last one is called determinism. Determinism is the idea that everything, all events, all motion, all causality, is causally predetermined. Everything that happens is predetermined by a few things, by the initial conditions and the forces acting on them. This is physics in a nutshell, and the idea, the paradigm here is anything at all that happens can be explained this way. Mechanical, clockwork, cause and effect. And in fact, in this deterministic model, there isn't room for any surprises. Because if you know the initial conditions precisely enough of the universe, and you know what the physical laws are that govern it, everything plays out perfectly predictably, like goddamn Nostradamus. All right, according to these scientists, everything is predetermined. And that means a couple things. It has implications. And one of those implications is you don't have any free will, because you can't choose to act otherwise if everything is predetermined. And there is no surprises in nature, because if you know the initial conditions and you know the forces involved, you know everything that will ever happen till the end of time, full stop. Realism, materialism, reductionism, determinism. This is the platform upon which modern science rests. Federico, like many other people, have a criticism of this. The criticism of this seemingly solid bedrock foundation of science is those rules that we just discussed do not account for all of reality. They do not account for all of experience. I mean, we have conscious experience. I'm having it right now, and so are you. We have, or at least think we have, free will, the ability to act or choose our decisions or to act otherwise. But according to realism, materialism, reductionism, and determinism, that is impossible. It's impossible for you to be conscious. It's impossible for you to have free will. And if you think you have either, you're stuck in some sort of hallucination or illusion or something like that. That is a tough pill to swallow for many people. It's hard to argue that I am myself conscious. That's one of the only, in fact, bedrock reality of my existence, of my identity, the fact that I am conscious. Very, very difficult to rob me of that or to convince me otherwise. And yet, the scientific philosophical paradigm says that is exactly the case. All right, so we're going to get into the book now, into Federico's criticisms of this scientific paradigm. So I'm going to call this first section the failure of the scientific paradigm. And I'm going to let Federico do the talking here. He says, based on the known laws of physics, we should be completely unconscious. In fact, the taste of wine, the scent of a rose, the color orange, and the love for a sun should not exist, because no scientist can explain how electrical or biochemical signals can produce these qualia. The fact that each of us feels them and knows because of them is indisputable. And this falsifies the idea that current physical theories describe all of reality. If we believe that inanimate matter can explain all of reality, we support an assumption already falsified by the fact that we are conscious. We cannot let physicalism and reductionism leave consciousness out from the description of the universe. The universe must contain the seeds of both mind and matter. All right, so he's focusing on consciousness here, and he uses the word qualia. And so I want to explain to you that if you don't remember this from prior episodes or just already know this, that consciousness is a weird phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that science can't explain, as he said. He said not a single scientist can tell you how electrical or biochemical signals in your brain or body can produce these sensations that he was outlining, like the taste of wine or the scent of a rose or the color orange. It can't, because it's not physical. None of that is physical. The philosopher David Chalmers did a great job in his book, The Conscious Mind, making this argument. And he said, consciousness does not supervene on the physical. What that means is there's nothing about the laws of physics or about matter or energy or any of the scientific stuff that we know or claim to know that explains how or why consciousness exists. What consciousness is, physics can tell you nothing about that. That's weird. That indicates that consciousness is not physical. And if these physical laws and physical descriptions are supposed to describe all of reality, and yet they can't describe consciousness, something is wrong. Something is missing. And the whole foundations here are starting to shake. And the thing doing it is the one undeniable reality that every single one of us is faced with. I am conscious. Right? So clearly there must be a larger reality, a vaster reality than just the physical. And the materialist scientists of today will say, no, consciousness is just an illusion. It's an emergent phenomenon. It's something that isn't real. And David Chalmers, the philosopher, asks, why is it that all of the activity of physics and matter in the world, all the things you can describe by science and measure and reproduce and all of that, why is it that all of that isn't happening in the dark? And what he means by that is, if an animal has to drink, right? I'm drinking wine. I'm tasting this wine, like he said earlier in the example. I have to drink because I need calories and I need water and I need things to survive. So there's like an evolutionary explanation. Fair enough. But none of that requires that wine tastes like wine. Why does that happen at all? Why is there a experience of what it's like to drink wine? Why is there not just drinking wine in the dark? This is the question. Why consciousness? Why? Could not every biological being be just a biological robot? And all the things that we do, eating and reproducing and defecating and, all the things that we do, all the biological things we do in order to survive, all that can be done without any memories or experience of it. Just wind the clock and let us go. Why is there any experience at all? And science can't say why or what it is. What is consciousness? And so Federico says we can't just erase that the way that physicalists try to do. We can't just brush it off because we're faced with it. Consciousness is the only unquestionable reality. If everything else is an illusion, certainly the fact that I'm conscious and able to consider whether or not everything around me is an illusion, certainly that thing I can't deny. And yet physics denies. All right, Federico continues. He says, mind and matter are like the inner and outer surfaces of a sphere, and ontology belongs to the whole sphere. All right, there's more, but this is a little poetic, so let me just explain what he means here. He's saying that earlier he said that the universe must contain the seeds of both mind and matter, because we experience both mind and matter in this physical world. And then he goes on to say mind and matter are like the inner and outer surfaces of a sphere, and ontology belongs to the whole sphere. Ontology is like being or reality. So mind and matter are the inside and outside surfaces of this one thing we're calling reality. Both things are there, right? The inside and the outside. They're both there and they're both one thing. And yet we're narrowly focused on only the matter part, only the outside. And we pretend that the inside doesn't exist. Okay, he says, physics needs to also deal with the interiority of reality, what we call mind, which includes consciousness. If the only reality we admit is the one we can measure with rulers and clocks, we have eliminated the inner reality. By doing so, we accept consciousness and free will are illusions, despite the evidence of their existence within each of us. Just hair stands up in my arms. How can you deny it? And we insist in the scientific community, we insist on denying it. But how can you deny, he says, despite the evidence of the damn thing within you? I don't know. It reminds me of kind of the unforgivable sin parameters in the Bible. What is the sin that can't be forgiven? Sin against the Holy Spirit, right? I don't know why, but this is coming to mind when I read this. Denying the existence of consciousness, even though it's within you, and is the most obvious thing to you and everyone, that you couldn't even think without it. You don't exist without it. To deny that thing seems unforgivable to me. Now, aren't scientists supposed to be curious? Aren't they supposed to be trying to answer the difficult questions? To ignore that, boy, it seems unforgivable. All right, he goes on. He says, when we consider that the elementary parts of which everything is made behave like probability waves and are influenced by random fluctuations of the quantum vacuum, true reductionism cannot exist. All right, so now he's getting into kind of nuts and bolts of quantum physics, but what he's saying here is if the elementary parts that everything's made of, the atoms, and the constitutive elements of those atoms, if those things behave like probability waves, well, there's no certainty there, is there? Right? Well, this is the whole double slit experiment idea that you shoot light through through a screen with slits in it, with two slits in it, and rather than getting the light particles coming through each slit and landing directly behind where you'd expect them to, you get this interference pattern. You get this stripy pattern where these particles, these photons, are hitting the screen in places where they have no business hitting the screen. If you shot them through like a particle, they would only go straight through the hole and hit the screen. Yet they're over here where there is no hole. How's that happen? Well, because light is a wave and it's a particle at the same time, and you get all this quantum weirdness. So this is what he's talking about here. He's saying that the photon, the little particle of light, isn't just a particle of light like you'd expect, like I threw a billiard ball, but instead it's this quantum wave of probability. It could be here, it could be there, so the certainty is gone, right? The basis of the solid matter all around us is behaving like this. No certainty, but instead probability. That's weird. And then he says, but it gets worse than that, though. It's not that these quantum bits that make up the world are behaving in some sort of probabilistic way with no certainty to speak of. But on top of that, they're influenced by random fluctuations of the quantum vacuum. What does that mean? Well, nobody quite knows. Except for when you go out in space and you remove all of the things from the space and you create a vacuum, what you find is that you can never get rid of everything in it because what they call virtual particles, little spontaneous eruptions of energy, flash in and out of this vacuum. Right? There's nothing in there. How did they get in there? Where does it come from? Right? I don't know. But it's proven that this is what happens. So you've got energy that is in an empty space that appears and disappears randomly as though it's erupting from some other part of reality that we cannot see or understand. It pops into the vacuum and then it goes away. And those sorts of random energy from nowhere, influences that we don't understand, those things are impacting the quantum world. So where's the certainty when everything's behaving like a probability? And even the probabilities we can calculate are subject to the random fluctuations of the influence of this energy we can't understand called vacuum energy. Like, where is the predictability? Where is the certainty in the physical world? And so Federico, he kind of leans on this by saying that there's a certain element of novelty that's baked right into reality, a certain level of unpredictability. Right? Because these quantum fluctuations just happen unexplainably, don't even really know what they are, and they influence the physical world unexplainably. And so there are going to be things that will happen outside of this clockwork deterministic universe. Because if the clock is ticking away, doing everything it's supposed to do, and suddenly energy from the quantum vacuum pops in and makes a little tweak, the clock isn't going to work the way that the determinism says it should work. So you lose the unpredictability. You have this experience of novelty baked right in, of unpredictability baked right in. So the universe cannot be reduced to its physical parts, and it cannot be strictly determined. There cannot be a clockwork universe the way that many scientists believe. All right, Werner Heisenberg, one of the, again, OG quantum physics physicists, he postulated the famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You probably heard that before if you've ever studied quantum mechanics. So this is a mathematical relationship that shows the impossibility of measuring the position and momentum of a particle. Okay, the precious determinism of classical physics was falsified where it hurt most, because the nature of the elementary particles, which should have determined everything, proved to be indeterministic and probabilistic. All right, so Werner Heisenberg is saying this uncertainty principle that I was talking about, this novelty creation principle that's baked right into the laws of physics, this is what Werner Heisenberg is pointing to. You cannot know these multiple variables. If we're talking about the quantum world, the position and momentum of a particle, you cannot know them both simultaneously. There's always going to be an uncertainty in one or the other variable. There's always going to be some unknowable, uncalculable component. There's novelty baked right in. And he's saying, once we know this, the determinism of classical physics breaks down entirely. We cannot rely on reductionism, because these particles that make up the quantum world don't follow these laws strictly that we thought they followed. So they're not deterministic. They're probabilistic. And even that has got this novelty baked into it. It's weird, right? So we're shaking the foundations, right? Now let's do it more. I'm going to move on to the next section, which I'm going to call Quantum Mechanics and Einstein. Again, these are the two cogs of the quantum revolution. So let's get right into Federico's perspective on how the advances, the cutting edge advances in modern physics, continue to disprove and rattle these philosophical scientific foundations, and continue to point ever more in the direction of his own philosophical preference, in the direction of idealism or panpsychism. So not only is he going to say that all of these revelations from quantum physics are shaking the foundations that they're based upon, but instead they're pointing to some other foundation. They're all seemingly pointing to the observer, to consciousness, to mind, as something that is fundamental. So let's get in. Federico says, the difficulty in understanding quantum physics is mainly due to it describing the characteristics of the inner rather than the outer world. Hear that? So he's saying quantum mechanics describes mind or consciousness or perception maybe. It describes the observer, not what's being observed. Quantum mechanics is weird because we think it describes the world out here. It doesn't. It describes the world in here. Isn't that amazing? So he's saying all this weirdness about, things can't be in two places at once. Okay, well then we learn about entanglement. Things can't be, in two states at once. And then we learn about particle wave duality. There's all these sorts of things that quantum physics sort of throws in the face of logic. And he's saying that all that stuff ceases to be weird and starts to make sense if we realize that what quantum mechanics, or quantum physics, is describing is not the objective world out there. It's describing whatever it is that David Chalmers was describing, whatever it is that is happening within us, right? When we observe the world, when we observe whatever it is that's there to be observed, okay? When we do that, we see the world around us. we don't know for sure if what we're seeing is real. We don't know for sure if our perceptions give us any comprehensive understanding of what's really out there. There's no reason to think, evolutionarily speaking, that our perceptions of the world are anything other than a survival mechanism. I look out at the world, I don't see the ones and zeros of the matrix, I see streets and people and things like that. But I don't know which is the real reality, the ones and zeros or the objects that are being manifested by those ones and zeros. So there's a little matrix reference for you. But in any case, if quantum mechanics describes that, consciousness or mind perceiving, if that's what we're learning when we're doing these quantum experiments, then maybe all this weirdness starts to seem less weird. Well, let's get into the evidence. All right, Faggin says, Einstein discovered that time and space depend on the relative velocity between observer and observed. Okay, you probably know this, you've heard this is called special relativity. And it's telling us here that time and space are not absolute. That time and space have everything to do with the perspective of the observer and the observed. If the observer is moving away at a certain speed, and the observed is stationary or moving at another speed, like all of these things have to be taken into consideration in order to have any understanding of time and space. And it's certainly not the one that we assume to be true, that time and space are static and absolute. No. Einstein proves through relativity that it's dependent on the relative velocity between observer and observed. So Einstein also discovered that simultaneity of events was not absolute, but was relative to the motion of the observer. So the concept of causality also lost its absolute status. This is weird, right? It's like, I think the experiment here, if I remember correctly, is like one of these stars that explode. There's a word for that, I can't think of it. But a star has exploded, and they see this, through their, satellites or radar or whatever it is that they use. They see this explosion. Now it turns out that explosion, if I was in, a spaceship traveling, at whatever, a third of the speed of light or something like that, that explosion would not be simultaneous to the person traveling fast in that spaceship, or the person standing on the Earth, or a satellite or an asteroid flying by at a different speed from somewhere else. That they might actually see this explosion sooner or later than the other observers in this model. So even the idea that events might happen at the same time, like objectively something happens now, well, that's also wrong. And it's wrong because it depends, right? It's not absolute, but depends on the status of the observer. Time, space, and causality depend on the observer, and in fact, cannot be said to exist without them. Time, space, and causality depend, right, on the fact of an observer. I mean, if there were no observer, this is like if the tree falls in the forest, it's like that thing. If there is no observer, is there time? Is there space? Is there causality? If no one's there to see it, right? Einstein says no. And this gives you another hint about there being some vaster reality, something there outside of our perceptions that we can't understand. Something that science can't measure. All right, he goes on, he says, in the quantum reality, each observer has its own frame of reference. And if the frame changes, the description also changes. Special and general relativity have clearly demonstrated this fact. There's no privileged point of view that can describe all of reality from the outside in an objective way, because each observer is also part of what is observed and can only have one point of view, right? There is nothing standing outside of the cosmos that can look at it objectively, because all the things that can observe the cosmos are part of the cosmos. And every one of us has a different perspective. Not just a different status of motion of observer and observed, but a different status, a different perspective, right? And everything's relative, right? All right, that brings us back to Heisenberg uncertainty. He says this about that. He says, the view of the universe that emerges from the description of quantum states is very strange, because variables, like the particle's position and momentum, assume a defined value only when two particles interact. Listen to that. Particles assume a defined value only when they interact, right? So this is the idea of the wave. The photons are a wave. The light is a wave coming towards that double slit screen that we talked about earlier. And only when it interferes with itself, when it interacts with itself, that's the interference pattern, or only when it strikes another particle, let's say, only when it has an interaction does it assume a defined value. Only when it has an experience does the wave become a particle. So when an observation is made, right? So reality requires an observation. It requires experience. It has no defined value. It sort of blurs out of existence and fades back into that weird quantum reality that has no defined value. It has no defined existence. It's that vaster reality that we can't wrap our scientific arms around. So when that's happening, we're in this sort of weird scientific la-la land. But the moment those two are mathematical la-la land, and the moment that particle has an experience, an interaction, whether it be with itself through interference or with another particle, boom, suddenly that wave of probability existing in the quantum realm, whatever that means, becomes a physical particle in the here and now. So what that means is reality as we know it requires experience, observation, consciousness. He says, when a quantum particle is not observed, it cannot be located in space like a classical particle. Right? When a quantum particle is not observed, when it's in that quantum wave-like state that is real and is simultaneously isn't real somehow, at least not yet, no one can say what it is or where it is. It cannot be said to exist exactly until it's observed. He says, where and how then do particles exist when we do not observe them? And what makes them show up as particles? Okay, and this is the fundamental question of quantum physics, the Copenhagen interpretation, as they call it, the interpretation of Niels Bohr and some of these early quantum physicists, is that where particles exist when you don't observe them is the quantum realm. And what makes them show up as particles is being observed. Interaction. That's what they call wave function collapse. So consciousness plays a role in bringing reality out of this misty potential of what the quote-unquote quantum world of probability. You can attach any scientific or mathematical sounding word you want to that. The quantum reality is something that sounds very strange and spiritual to me. All right, then very importantly, he makes this point, kind of making a parallel between consciousness and the quantum reality. He talks about this idea of what is called a pure quantum state. And so what this means is the state of a quantum system where all the information is known. You have complete knowledge of the quantum system. This is an important concept in quantum mechanics, okay? And this is what he says about it. He says a pure quantum state is not clonable Just means it cannot be reproduced. And therefore has all the extraordinary properties of a conscious experience, which is also definite and private. A pure state is only knowable from the inside by the system that is in that state, exactly like it is in our experience. Now, this is probably over your head upon the first reading, but this is a very significant point. He's making this equivalency between this very important concept in quantum mechanics of a pure quantum state. It's something that, again, a quantum state where all the information is knowable, but it's, as we said earlier, the only thing that's capable of knowing, right, having knowledge, knowing all the information in the system, right, that's a conscious being in the system. There's no objective knowledge outside of the system because the only thing that can know is a part of the system. So a pure quantum state can only be known from the inside. And critically, this is identical to the characteristic of consciousness that separates it from all other things. Consciousness is something that is knowable only from the inside. So you can see me and know me very well. The other tongue on the podcast has grown up with me since I was 5 years old, knows me perhaps better than anybody on earth. But he doesn't know everything about me. There's things that I keep even from the people I love the most. And so it would be true to say that a conscious being such as myself or yourself is only fully knowable by you because you're the only one who knows the interiority. Other people might know the exteriority, but only you know the inside, just like a pure quantum state. So there is something in nature that is like a pure quantum state. Maybe even that's what it's describing, right? Our experience. And this is why Federico says that quantum mechanics is describing the interiority. It's describing experience, conscious experience, and not what's materially, physically out there being experienced. Amazing. So quantum mechanics shares the fundamental quality of consciousness, right? So maybe consciousness is more fundamental to physics than people like to admit. But there's more. We haven't talked about probability yet. We will. But there's also an important idea in quantum physics that, especially nowadays, is cutting edge. And this is the idea of information. Quantum information. This is what physicists believe today is more fundamental even than the quantum fields from which matter emerges. This is quantum information, something that might even be pre-exists the quantum fields. Maybe that's where the quantum fields come from or what have you. So let's just dig into this idea of information and see if we can see Federico's perspective here. He says, the word information comes from the Latin informa, that is, to give shape to something. Information we do not yet know how to properly define. The central concept of information has to do with the relationship between an observer and an event. The event brings with it new knowledge for the observer. Therefore, information is related to the state of knowledge of the observer himself. I don't think anyone would disagree so far, right? He says, it is impossible to speak in absolute terms of information, since it depends not only on the event, but also on the observer. The same event can carry different meanings to different observers, right? So that's another callback to this idea of relativity. All right, he goes on, he says, some scholars explain information by saying that it is proportional to the degree of surprise of the recipient. Other people claim that information is the resolution of uncertainty. Others, a measure of freedom of choice. But note, however, that surprise, uncertainty, and freedom of choice only make sense in relation to conscious entities. Whew, and the hair on my arms stands up. You hear that? Information only makes sense because in perspective of an observer, because it requires an observer. Information requires a knower. What is information unless somebody can know it? Information requires a knower. And then he's like, regardless of how people choose to define this idea of information, whether you call it the resolution of uncertainty or freedom of choice or degree of surprise, none of those ideas, surprise, uncertainty, none of those ideas make any sense outside of a conscious entity. All right, he goes on, he says, with the discovery in 1961 of the genetic code embedded in DNA, life also became connected with information. In the field of physics, the idea that information could be more fundamental than matter was first advanced by John Wheeler. Again, Wheeler's one of those OG quantum physicists. He says the basic idea is that everything is made up of information. Recently, the theoretical physicist Giacomo D'Aronio have shown that quantum mechanics can be derived entirely from quantum information. Okay, this is cutting edge theoretical physics. And what he's saying here is that physics can be derived entirely from information. He says quantum physics could be interpreted as follows. Matter energy is simply made of quantum bits, which manifest themselves in the form of classical bits when they are observed. Okay. So that makes the idea of the collapse of the wave function, right? Quantum bits become classical bits. They collapse, just like we talked about with the photons being a probability wave collapsing into a particle with certain momentum and position. This is the idea of wave function collapse. You got this mystical, numinous world of potential or probability that collapses down into reality. What Wheeler and D'Aronio are saying is that information is what collapses into material being. So the fundamental reality has to do with information. And information is meaningless without a knower. So that makes consciousness now, or mind, fundamental, doesn't it? All right, one last bit on this. He says, within a deterministic system, the concept of information makes no sense because every action is perfectly predictable. The necessary and sufficient condition for the existence of information is the existence of consciousness. Whew, buddy. Right? So if the world is deterministic, information wouldn't make sense because everything happens like clockwork. There is no information outside of that process. If there is, that's something new. It's like a bug in the system, right? Everything falls apart. Determinism falls apart. And again, information makes no sense apart from the existence of consciousness. And that brings me to probability. Remember, this is another fundamental idea. The probability wave, that we just described. Particles have no certain position or momentum or any kind of certainty around them until they interact, and then they become certain and so forth. So probability is fundamental to this quantum realm. And what does he have to say about it? He says, the fact that quantum physics is about probability is saying that the physical universe is about knowing. Let me say that again. The fact that quantum physics is about probability is saying that the physical universe is about knowing. He says the white elephant in the room is thus consciousness. Probability only makes sense if it implies the existence of consciousness. He goes on, he says, probability is a human concept, inextricably linked to the degree of knowledge of a conscious observer. This concept makes no sense for an unconscious, deterministic system. Probability is about knowledge, and only consciousness can know. If the universe were deterministic, the notions of observer and probability would make no sense. For inside such a universe, everything is preordained, and outside of it, no observer could exist. The concept of observer, consciousness, knowledge, meaning, probability, information would make no sense if the whole were deterministic and reductionistic. Can you feel the foundations of the scientific paradigm trembling? All right, that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call Vaster Reality, Mind-Matter Hyperspace. We've heard about this mind-matter hyperspace before. Dr. Shersted Hughes out of the UK, we read his stuff and talked about him in the early years. This is something that he suggested in his book, Modes of Sentience. Check that out if you're interested. But again, we've talked so much here about how how these quantum experiments and the things we've learned about quantum reality, they all seem to imply the significance or centrality of mind or consciousness. We've also talked about all kinds of weirdness that can't be explained through just ordinary logic and classical thinking, like we talked about entanglement and particle wave duality and all kinds of weirdness of quantum mechanics. And so the idea here is, if there is a vaster reality that science could know, if it could wrap its arms around the quantum reality and the classical reality together, that there is something in the current state of science that's not explored or left out. We haven't figured out how to explore, but we continue to deny that consciousness exists as a reality. So we're not studying it, right? But what if this vaster reality is not just the material, physical reality? What if it's sort of a mind-matter hyperspace? It's the vaster reality is the interiority, the mind part that keeps getting left out of the equation. What if this vaster reality, if the real world is not just physics and matter, but a mind-matter situation? Faggin says, quantum information represents a world that is invisible and unknowable from the outside. Okay, interesting. Quantum mechanics, the quantum world represents this invisible, unknowable part of reality. That's weird, right? It reminds me of the way Jung talks about, some of these depth psychologists talk about consciousness and then the unconscious. It's like we are something. Our psyche is something that is conscious, but also unconscious. There's this deep, vast, unconscious component to our psyche. It's invisible, right? It's unknowable. I don't seem to have access to it. Yet it seems to supply, the substance of my motivations and intuitions and my dreams and things like that. Like it's powerful and acts upon us. There's some kind of analogy that can be made here from the psychological perspective of the unconscious and this scientific perspective of the quantum realm. That's fascinating. I don't have time to necessarily go into that idea right now, but it does point to this idea of a vaster reality, and it makes it more familiar to us, right? This idea of an unconscious component to our experience, that's something most people can appreciate. Also, this is like the quantum realm, invisible and unknowable, and yet potent and effective in the world. He says, the semantic reality, by that he means the reality of meaning. He says the semantic reality does not exist in the same space-time as physical reality, but in an experiential space and time closer to the space and time of our dreams. Interiority is not a physical dimension. Okay, so he's saying that the dimension of meaning, the dimension of consciousness, the dimension of qualia, the experiences we were talking about, that seem to be unnecessary and yet exist, like what it's like to taste wine rather than just drinking wine for survival, what it's like to fall in love rather than just making love for survival. These are all things that exist that do not exist in the physical dimension, in the dimension that matter and physics exists in. Right? They don't supervene on the physical like Chalmers told us. They exist, but they aren't physical. They exist, but they're not governed by the laws of physics or matter. Okay, that implies a vaster reality than what science allows. He says the universe that we can objectively observe is only the symbolic portion of a much vaster semantic symbolic reality. Right? He talked about this before when he was talking about interiority and exteriority. Like the world is made up of both things, mind and matter, semantic and symbolic. There is a bifurcation in reality that you can see on every level of analysis if you know what to look for. The universe that we can objectively observe is only the symbolic portion of a much vaster semantic symbolic reality. You might also say a much vaster quantum classical reality, or a much vaster spiritual material reality. And we could be talking about synonyms in every one of those cases. All right, he says, quantum information processing cannot be performed in space-time with classical matter because qubits and their entanglement are non-local properties. So where does quantum computation take place? This question has puzzled scientists since the inception of this technology, but there's still no adequate answer. All right, so there's more here, but all right, so now we're talking about quantum computing, and the idea is we are obviously developing that technology, and it's working, but we have no idea how it works, right? Because computers work on the basis of a binary system, ones and zeros. We call that a bit, right? But he's talking about qubits, which are quantum bits, and they can be a 1, a 0, or some combination of the two, 1 and 0 at the same time. That's what makes the difference here. And he's saying that that 1 and 0 at the same time bit, that this is a non-local situation. This is something that exists in the quantum world, but not in the physical world, right? It's something that exists, and we know it exists because we use it, and it's part of quantum computing. We just don't have any idea how it works exactly. But what it does do is it implies something. He asks the question that points this out. He says, so where does quantum computation take place? It doesn't take place with classical bits in space-time because it has this quantum component. It takes place in the quantum realm somehow, and that implies a realm that isn't physical. And it gets deeper than this. He says, according to the current conception of quantum physics, the physical universe is the result of the collapse of the wave function. However, the computation possibility of qubits goes well beyond the possibilities of the matter manifested in spacetime. This indicates that there must exist a greater reality. All right, so this clarifies a little bit what he was saying before. He's saying that if you take all of the matter that exists in the cosmos and you assign binary bits, if you calculate the computation capacity of all of the matter that exists in the cosmos, it is insufficient. It does not explain quantum computing. So what that means is there must be more than what's in the physical world that is accessible to us because we're using it in quantum calculations. There must be more to reality because all of the matter that exists in the world is not enough to account for the computation capabilities of quantum computing. All of this pointing to a vaster reality, that the quantum realm is a part of a vaster reality than the physical. And then he ends this way. He says, precisely because we all dream, can we all understand how we can become engrossed, identified with different realities to the point of believing that only those realities exist. And the point he's making here is that when you're dreaming, you don't know the distinction between the dream and reality. When you're dreaming, you believe that is the real reality. You have no hint at all. Unless you're a lucid dreamer, you have no hint whatsoever that there's a reality beyond the one you're living out in your dream, even though it's completely virtual, created by your mind, that sort of thing. And he's like, every single one of us is guilty of that. Every single one of us wakes up from one of those terrible dreams that seems so real, and we're relieved that it was just a dream, because up until the moment we realized, we had absolutely no consideration that it wasn't 100% genuine reality. And because we're all guilty of that, we have to understand how we could become accustomed to living in a classical world, to living in a physical material world, and ceasing to believe that there's more possible beyond the physical and beyond the material, that we just become so acclimated to this reality, we forget that there's more to it than just the physical. And perhaps this is the sin of the modern scientist. All right, that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call the awakening. And I saved it to the end, even though Federico puts this at the beginning of the book. The reason I saved it to the end is, I didn't want to color anybody's opinion of all the science talk until we get to this, so it was strategic. But the other thing is that the way I laid out this episode is like he's pointing out the flaws in this sort of scientific paradigm, and that it points to a vaster reality, that reality that contains all the quantum weirdness, but also all of the unphysical or non-physical components of reality, consciousness and meaning and mind and all these things. And it's very difficult to shake yourself loose from the patterns that are useful for our survival. And if we're never confronted with the reality of there being more to existence than what we've always imagined and experienced, we're not really open to considering it. And I think this is true of most scientists. You're not going to see many scientists that are psychonauts, as an example, that are expanding their consciousness or doing deep meditation or religious practices. They're just not going to see that these days. So our scientists are never putting themselves in a position where they can be introduced to the reality of a non-physical realm or component of our experience. Now, our religious teachings for millennia have gone contrary to that, and we ignore them, especially in the scientific community, as, hokum and nonsense and superstition. And I think maybe this was true of Federico, living his whole life, deep into computer science and making all these important contributions and never thinking about, anything beyond, the material here and now. Maybe having these doubts and thoughts in the back of his mind of sort of gaps in scientific knowledge and unexplainable things, but putting it off to the side. But then he has an experience, like I had. He had an experience that made it impossible for him to continue living that way. He had that experience of waking up from the dream and realizing that reality is more than what you thought it was a moment ago. So I'm going to call this section The Awakening. And I want to tee it up the way that Federico did. He said, little by little, the ego realizes that the reality in which he exists is not the deepest reality, and comprehends that he is more than the body. This type of experience is necessary to free the ego from the self-induced trance of believing itself to be the body. The opportunity to experience that there is a vaster reality can be obtained through some extraordinary experiences of consciousness. Exactly. And when he says that this type of experience he's describing can free the ego from the self-induced trance of believing itself to be limited to the body, this is something like what he was saying before, when he said, precisely because we dream, we can all understand how we can become engrossed and identified with different realities to the point of believing that only those realities exist. I am only the body. I am only my body, because I have no memories, I have no experiences that show me a reality of who I am, of my identity, beyond the limits of my body. All right, he says, an experience of spontaneous awakening, which made me realize that consciousness is fundamental and beyond matter. And he tells this story. He says, in December 1990, I woke up around midnight, and suddenly felt a powerful rush of energy emerge from my chest. This alive energy was love, so intense and so incredibly fulfilling. Even more surprising was the fact that the source of this love was me. I experienced it as a broad beam of shimmering white light gushing from my heart with incredible strength. Then suddenly that light exploded. It filled the room and expanded to embrace the entire universe. I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the substance out of which everything that exists is made. This was what created the universe out of itself. Then, with immense surprise, I recognized that I was that light. What made this event astonishing was its impossible perspective, because I was both the experiencer and the experience. I was simultaneously the observer of the world and the world. I was the world observing itself. For the first time in my life, I had experienced the existence of another dimension of reality. Oh, buddy. I love it. So I had my own mystical experience. I've talked about it ad nauseum here. I've talked about it before, and you probably all already know. But it was something much like this experience. The emphasis on love and this sort of experience falling on you so dramatically and suddenly the way it does. If this feeling of embracing the universe, becoming one with the universe. He says he says without a shadow of a doubt he knew this was the substance out of which everything is made. This inability to doubt or question the experience. This is something that is common of mystical experiences. They have a word for it. It's called noetic. So it's a noetic experience. And then the best part, as far as I'm concerned, is he's got this love, whatever that means, flowing out of him, and he feels like whatever this is that is him is also the whole cosmos. It's what he's made of, but also the whole cosmos is made of. But what really gets him is this weird merging of subject and object, where he says that he was the experiencer and the experience. So, right, he feels himself no longer bound to his body, but expanding to encompass everything. And he says, I recognize that I was that light. Right now, this is so important. This is what's called in religious parlance apotheosis. This is the experience of feeling himself to be one with God. Right? This love is flowing out from him. He realizes that what it is what he is, and then suddenly he realizes it's not just him, but what he is everything in the cosmos, everyone and everything that ever is or ever was. So he became God in that moment, one with God. He unified experience and experiencer. He was the totality, as Jung would say. And he says, in that showed him for the first time in his life, there's more to reality than just the physical. There's a vaster reality that perhaps is explained by so much of this quantum research. All right, so that brings me to the next section as we're kind of winding down here. And I want to call this section The Implications. If you're a fan of It's Always Sunny, hopefully you get a laugh out of that. The Implications. So this is a bunch of stuff that Federico said throughout the book, just a handful of things that you might call them speculative, but they are the implications of everything he said so far. He has this mystical experience. He makes all the connections to this, to the revelations of quantum physics, and he has this one with the universe, apotheosis experience, and it has implications, right? And so let me just tell you what he said about it, what conclusions he came to. He said, reality is continually created by the interactions that take place between its parts, and then he emphasizes parts that are not separable, and each observation changes both the observer and the observed. Okay, so the idea here is that you've got the whole, and you've got all the parts that make up the whole. And he's saying that the existence of both the parts and the whole are sort of mutual and inseparable. So the interaction of the parts and the whole are sort of mutually creating each other. And this is an interesting idea. I thought it was a novel idea. I thought it was my idea, and I read it from Federico here. He talks about these quantum to classical transformations, or spiritual to material transformations. You might think of it that way. And so there's like this process going on, from parts to whole, from quantum to classical, from potential to actual. There's this back and forth, right, between subject and object, between creator and creation. And he describes it perfectly in exactly the same way that I described it when I had my own mystical experience. I tried to come up with some names, some ways of talking about my ideas, and a few of them were dynamic monism or cyclical non-dualism. So I thought these were novel ideas, and here Federico is speaking exactly the same language. Fascinating as far as I'm concerned, that we would both come to this exact conclusion that what the cosmos is essentially a process of God experiencing itself. It's the manifestation of God's self-experience. And he's saying exactly this in his own sort of scientific way. He also says, creation is one's continuous endeavor to know itself evermore. And by this he means the created cosmos is God's endeavor to know itself. So reality is God's self-experience, as I've always said. One of the things I've said more than ever on this podcast is we are the experience God is having. Right? This is what Federico's saying. All right, he says, if one is the totality of what exists, both potentially and actually. Now, when he says one here, he's really referring to a conscious quantum field or conscious quantum information, something like that. But by that he really just means a description of God. So if God is the totality of what exists, both potentially and actually, God is the creator, the creation, and the beneficiary of its own creation and becoming, right? Remember when he had that mystical experience and he said he became the experiencer as well as the experienced. He became the totality. This is what he's saying here, creator and creation simultaneously. And then he says, from my perspective, the only possible way to explain how the universe can create life and consciousness is that the universe is itself alive and conscious from the outset. One is the interiority of all that exists. Stated differently, God is the interiority of all that exists. It is what connects all creations from within. And this is interesting because he spoke in the same way about entanglement in the book. Entanglement being the interiority of all things, that which connects all things. How is it possible for a signal to reach an atom further away than light can travel instantaneously when a particle that's entangled with it over here has a change of state? So you flip a switch and instantly the entangled particle, who's so far away that light can't even reach it in that time, instantly changes to match its partner. How can that happen? Right? If the signal's happening faster than the speed of light, then the only way of explaining that is to say that they're connected mysteriously from the inside. And what that connection is the unity, the fundamental unity of all things. That's God, right? That's what he's saying. That brings me to my conclusion. What I find the most compelling about Faggin's ideas weren't his Whiteheadian speculations about how mind might become matter, or his myriad arguments on why consciousness will always be beyond the power of computation. No, what I found most compelling was the way Faggin describes quantum reality. His description of the quantum world embraces all the evidence and does not obfuscate or hide from it. It doesn't dismiss them as spooky action at a distance or God rolling dice the way that Einstein did. How is it that Faggin is able to reconcile quantum physics to the world of our experience when all the great physicists throw their hands up? And worse than that, they not only throw their hands, they throw away consciousness and free will with the bathwater. Faggin was able to do this because he has something all these great scientists did not. He had a first-hand experience of a realm of existence outside the domain of empirical science. Faggin had a mystical experience and perhaps a glimpse into the quantum. What he experienced was, of course, supernormal, supernatural, but also somehow familiar. When Faggin says that quantum information represents a world that is invisible and unknowable from the outside, he illuminates a timeless religious idea that we carry with us from our deepest ancestors. A world that is invisible and unknowable, but is somehow inseparable from the created world all around us. A world filled with forces and powers that influence us from within. What does that sound like to you? Does it sound like the realm of spirit, of the divine, of God? You bet it does. But where our ancestors saw fairies, gods, and spirits, Faggin sees conscious quantum fields. Where our ancestors saw fate and destiny, Faggin sees entanglement and quantum unity. Here's the question that's going to bake your noodle, as the Oracle said in the Matrix. Are these contrasting ideas or merely different language describing this self-same reality? Is the existence of a quantum reality underlying the material reality in which we live evidence for the spiritual reality of our ancestors and religions have always tried to open our eyes to? And before we close, I want to throw a bone to the committed scientific atheist types out there. You know who I mean. Those who read the works of our great scientists as gospel, while dismissing religious revelation as child's play. Maybe this message will sink in better coming from them. So I just want to wrap this up here by giving you what I'm going to call heretical scripture. But what this is quotations from some of the most important founders of quantum physics. Many of them we've spoken about already. I'm going to begin with Niels Bohr, who said this: "We can admittedly find nothing in physics or chemistry that has even a remote bearing on consciousness. Yet all of us know there is such a thing as consciousness, simply because we have it ourselves. Hence, consciousness must be part of nature, or more generally of reality, which means that, quite apart from the laws of physics and chemistry, as laid down in quantum theory, we must also consider laws of quite a different kind." Whew. How about a couple from Werner Heisenberg? He said, "The universe is not made up of things, but of vibratory energy networks that emerge from something even deeper and more subtle." Let me just repeat that last bit. Something even deeper. Isn't that amazing? A world, a reality deeper than the physical. Coming from Werner Heisenberg, folks, and he's got more. He says, "The idea of an objective real world, whose smaller parts exist objectively in the same sense as stones or trees, regardless of whether we observe them, is impossible. The term observer should be replaced by the term participant. This replacement could indicate a radically new role of consciousness in physics. Subjective and objective reality, in a sense, create each other." Motherfucker, that's good. Okay, how about Erwin Schrödinger? You guys remember Schrödinger's cat? You remember the Schrödinger equation? All right, this is him. He says, "Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental." All right, how about a couple from Max Planck, the guy that discovered the the theory of quanta, of energy being quantized. That Max Planck. The Planck Institute, that Max Planck. He says this: I consider consciousness as fundamental and matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot go beyond consciousness. Everything we consider as existing requires consciousness. Oh, man. All right, if that weren't the icing on the cake, guys, here's another. Modern physics impresses us particularly with the truth of the old doctrine, which teaches that there are realities existing apart from our sense perceptions, and that there are problems and conflicts where these realities are of greater value for us than the richest treasures of the world's experience.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.